Good morning, everybody. My name is Kato Hakudo, and thank you so much for joining us in our interview session by Reset Revolution. Just a little bit about who we are, if you've just forgotten a little bit. We are a group of high school students determined to shed more light and awareness on social justice issues, including mental health issues, as well as LGBTQ plus rights, and so much more. And today we'll be discussing a little bit about rainbow capitalism or rainbow commercialism, especially during Pride Month, which was in June. So if you'd like to stay updated on a more weekly basis, then follow us on Instagram. Anyways, today we are joined with Maëlla Cottin, who currently lives in Brussels, Belgium. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. So my name is Maëlla. I am a fresh 12th grade graduate, like Katoha, and I'm a part of the LGBT community.
Perfect. So right before we actually get to the real interview, could you give a brief definition of what rainbow commercialism and what specifically rainbow washing is?
Yeah, so they're a part of rainbow capitalism, as you mentioned earlier, which can essentially, I think, be summarized as like the commodification of the LGBT community as a means of making profit during Pride Month, which is in June, as you said. So we see it in rainbow commercialism, as you mentioned, where companies brand their products with symbolic rainbows to make sales, essentially. And the act of using the rainbow symbol is what you refer to as rainbow washing.
Perfect. So do you have any examples of what specifically rainbow commercialism looks like, when you go out in the mall and stuff like that?
Yeah, so for example, you might notice that certain brands and corporations and some of your favorite shops, including Zoom, I noticed, ASOS and Google changed their logos to include the rainbow pride colors, which happens during June and then sort of fizzles out in July. You might also notice that clothing brands and accessory brands might start selling things with rainbows on them during June.
Mm-hmm. So then could you explain how this, this larger idea of rainbow washing, rainbow commercialism, how is this an issue, especially in the past few weeks of June, and how is it thought about in the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, I mean, on the surface, it might seem like a positive thing, and in a sense, it is. It shows that the fashionable stance to have at the moment is one that's pro-LGBT. However, as with many other social issues, it's a multifaceted issue. It has lots of different points of views, and many people feel that the support tends to be very superficial. So companies will voice their support of the LGBT community only to the extent that's profitable to them and only during June, which sort of shows that it's not really an inherent value of the company in question. Meanwhile, LGBT people worldwide experience discrimination every day in the form of like microaggressions, legislations, even hate crimes. And I mean, on a personal level, it feels very superficial. It feels kind of betraying to know that supporting the community that I'm a part of is only really perceived as a source of potential income rather than as the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just want to take a pause for a little bit and just talk about some examples maybe. So while I was doing my own personal research, I realized that it wasn't even just, enterprises or, corporations, but it was also governments of specific places. And for instance, Atlanta, Georgia, they basically plastered a lot of crosswalks with rainbows, and that costed the city $200,000 in a way to, commemorate their rich history of LGBTQ plus rights. But it's once again, to the question of, do these, acts really promote the larger idea of what's important during Pride Month, and do they actually respect or do they actually create more allyship to the community? So I guess there's a very similar idea in pink washing as well during Breast Cancer Awareness Month, because when it becomes that month, everything's pink. And I just want to also ask, how does rainbow capitalism impact the larger importance of why we even have Pride Month to begin with?
Yeah, I mean, it is also very linked. It's also a topic of like disagreement within the LGBT community and within the wider community as well. The reason that we have Pride is, I mean, we tend to forget why we have Pride, which is that it was originally a riot. It was originally a march for queer liberation, whereas now, much like rainbow capitalism, it's been commodified. It's become a party and a celebration, which I suppose would be okay if it weren't for the fact that LGBT discrimination is still rampant, and we don't have queer liberation, we don't have equal rights.
Hmm. So could you know how at the very beginning of what you just explained, you said it was a little bit of like a not a controversial thing, but it's a pretty much debated thing with the Pride Month in general. Why is it so, debated and why is it so talked about within the community?
I think that it's very fair that it's debated. Partly it's because of, for example, people who have just come out, very young queers, who have just come out and who are really, really excited and they really want to be a part of Pride and everything. They love that it's a massive celebration. And, obviously they haven't really learned much about the history of Pride because it's not taught about in schools, which is another issue.
Mhm.
But then there's the older LGBT people who have distinct memories, perhaps, of Pride. I mean, it was a recent thing. There are people who have done their research. There are people who understand the extent of LGBT discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, who really want to make sure that Pride remains a march and remains significant, and there's thought into the act of going to Pride.
Mhm. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I just kind of want to diverge from the topic for a second and maybe talk about the lack of attention that the LGBTQ plus history as well, just education in general, really has a place in schools. And our viewers already know that many of us actually go to international schools, which is considered as a more inclusive, a little more diverse, and a little more open-minded than most schools. But how do you perceive, because personally speaking, when I was in health class, we didn't learn anything. Maybe we learned about the unicorn, but that's not really
Yeah.
a great thing either. So do you want to comment a little bit about education in that particular area?
I also remember the unicorn that you're referring to. Like, it was fine, great, but it didn't really help the actual LGBT people in the classroom. It was more of a way to explain to straight people what certain identities mean, and it was also a bit of a joke. Lots of people found it funny. Um, but outside of sex ed, I also think that we need to exist outside of sex ed. Otherwise, it leads into the whole issue of, sexualizing the gay community. I wish that we had learned about Pride, about Stonewall, about all the things that happened. And I'm one of the people who believes that it should be a central part of the school curriculum.
Hmm. Yeah, I want to talk on, I want to just expand on that a little bit more because I know that at least in our school there is an what is it called? The Ally Club or something? It's, the
Yeah.
LGBT plus club. And I feel like a lot of times, a lot of information and a lot of research or conversations about that specific, topics as important as this is very much restricted to people that are only interested in it. You know what I mean? So it's like, if you sign up for a club, that means you're already interested. So then, and it's important to explore what you're interested in more, but then what happens to the people that aren't interested? What happens to the people that remain uneducated? So I definitely think that's a really, really important issue. Do you have anything you want to, comment about that?
Yeah, I mean, I led that club in 11th grade,
Hmm.
and there were no cisgender heterosexual people in that club. So
Yeah.
it felt like I was teaching people things that they would already experience, that they have experienced, or that they will learn about by default because that's who they are. Whereas I really wanted to be teaching people who needed to know about it and who might be treating people poorly, who might not fully understand what it means to identify a certain way. And that's really, I think that should be the target group to educate.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. Um, yeah, so I also want to talk about just one more thing. About this type of education or LGBTQ plus education happening outside of sex ed in general. And I personally think that a great way or like a great segue to have these conversations is English class. If you read, I think you were in literature, right?
Yeah.
We read Carol Ann Duffy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think things like that, because I was talking to all my like Lang and Lit friends and they were like, we haven't, all of our authors are cis hetero white males. And I was like, wow, I maybe we had one hetero white male and I think that was it. And I think that's Sophocles. So so I think I definitely just wanted to comment on how important it is about like education and what is it? contact a little more about that particular subject outside of the sex ed course. So I want to go back to the main topic about rainbow capitalism for a second, and ask you, what would you say that these corporations are only taking advantage of Pride Month just for the sake of their own profits rather than assisting and honoring the LGBTQ plus community? Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I would say that. I would have to agree with that.
Mhm.
I mean, you see all these corporations celebrating Pride Month and outwardly saying that they support the LGBT community, but they're not directing any of these funds, as you said. They could be directing a portion of the Pride funds towards organizations like the Trevor Project, which would actually make a concrete difference. Instead, they're sort of objectifying the LGBT community as a means for making profit and as a means of personal gain.
Mhm.
I'm sure that there are groups that direct their funds towards allyship. I mean, it's a really good idea, and I'm sure that there are some really good companies out there, but it's also really important to remember that a vast majority of these really big companies that we know all about are often covertly even donating to anti-gay policies, not just being neutral and not taking a real stance, but being actively against, which is also something to remember and to look into, especially as a cishet person. But I also think that it's important to recognize, at the very least, some level of support towards the LGBT community is becoming expected, whereas before homophobia was expected. So, I mean, it's not black and white. There can be differing opinions, and that we can recognize the positive aspects of the rainbow being expected.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And I also want to just add another bit of an example that I once again found during my personal research. So you know how you talked a little bit about how some corporations, they can plaster a rainbow, but they also sometimes just don't support the community in general. And I think a really terrible but a really good example of this is Gilead. I'm not completely sure how to like specifically pronounce this, but it's a pharmaceutical company that makes the pill PrEP that can reduce the risk of HIV from sex by over 90%. And they've plastered rainbows everywhere. They've said, we respect, the community, and we will fund and we will donate stuff. And they have. However, the cost without insurance of that specific pill, that essentially reduces the risk of HIV greatly, without insurance is over $2,000. So, just looking at these statistics in general really shows how they're really just doing it for personal profit. And as you said earlier, which I thought was really interesting, objectifying the community and just the rainbow in general. So, yeah, obviously this is very, very significant, but also a very important subject to talk about, especially towards the end of Pride Month.
Yeah, and I mean, not to mention that in certain places, queer people can be fired for being queer, which means that they might not have access to that money. I mean, it's also something to consider.
Yeah, I think I saw a statistic or something about how the majority, I don't remember the specific percentage, but the majority of homeless children in the United States um, got kicked out of their house because they were, queer. So I think that further emphasizes the larger idea, and especially, if they're teenagers out on the street, they most likely will not be able to get the necessary money in order to, fund themselves for that pill. So, this already shows a lot about where the supposed support really goes to.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so and I think you've also already kind of like, briefly mentioned this, but I realized that there were also a lot of researchers that don't find rainbow washing as well as rainbow commercialism much of an issue, but rather a good way to really publicize the larger message about having a lot more presence within society. And they further argued that the mass production of rainbows, even if they are a product of capitalism, brings about more comfort, love, and support for those in need of unity. So what are your specific opinions about this?
Yes, I mean, I touched on this a little earlier. I came out when I was very young, and I'm still very young. And I do have to say that as someone who's still learning about my community and the people who forged the path for me in the past, I'm always really happy to see the rainbow flag. I can be critical of it, but like my gut reaction is just feeling comfort.
Mhm.
and I'm critical of it now because I know that it's sort of a means of replacing concrete action. Like the companies or even just individual people will wear a rainbow pin and assume that that is a way of replacing actual active support. However, to other LGBT people, I do want to say that it's absolutely okay and valid to critique, to feel happy and joyful when you see a rainbow flag, and to really enjoy the influx of rainbows and to wear it with pride, because it's not really your job to critique and fix the errors of a heteronormative patriarchal society when you're the ones who are being harmed by it. I would rather expect cisgender heterosexual people to be the ones who call out performative activism and who really do the thinking and the critiquing of these corporations, because they're not actively being harmed by it, although perhaps indirectly they are. So I really do think that it's their job to do their bit and to avoid relaxing by wearing a rainbow pin and deciding that that's their job done.
No, I completely agree. So I also just kind of want to talk about how, like, what the rainbow in general, really signifies, and how rainbow washing and rainbow commercialism could potentially harm or could categorize the entire community, and therefore cause the loss of a lot more, other perhaps disregarded or, like, frequently disregarded sexualities. So could you, say your opinion about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you're coming from a point of like the rainbow flag is used as a symbol
Yeah.
for the entire community without it really representing the entire community. And I don't know, I mean, it might not be the biggest issue, but I definitely understand where you're coming from. And I don't know if you're familiar with the sort of updated, very recent Pride flag, which includes a black and brown stripe and the blue, pink and white stripes for the trans community, which is definitely more inclusive, and it recognizes these two identities which have been very marginalized during Pride, despite them being at the forefront of the fight for Pride historically. So I think that if there's an opportunity to use that flag, definitely use it. It's a better, more inclusive version. But in another sense, the idea of using the rainbow flag as like a symbol for the entire community, I think it can also be harmful in that it might portray the community as very two-dimensional, fun-loving, stereotyped gay best friends, if that makes sense. Like it's ignoring the actual tangible real issues that the community goes through by just making all these fun products that are just really brightly colored and enjoyable. And I think it does disregard a certain struggle that people go through every day.
This is also just gonna kind of diverge again from the actual topic, but you kind of mentioned about, the gay best friend. I can at least name like 4 or 5 TV shows or even movies that have that particular role. But could you maybe explain a little bit about how this is also a really big issue and how it also further disregards, the entire history and the entire struggle of just the LGBTQ plus community?
Yeah, there's so much to say about that. I mean, as I said, it disregards the actual struggles of the gay community, and it's like free representation. It's palatable to straight people, to cis straight people, without making it difficult, without facing them with any difficult topics, without making them question their own allyship, because they've got a gay character. Sure, he's two-dimensional, he's white, he's cis, but he's gay, and that's representation, which, isn't fair, obviously. And I also think it ties into the whole sexualization of the LGBT community. You never see the lesbian best friend because lesbians are portrayed, even the word has such negative pornographic connotations, whereas the gay man is seen as an inoffensive best friend for the straight woman. So it ties into all of these really deep-rooted issues with representation.
Okay, so I think this might be our final question for today. How do you think such corporations should grow from here? Would it be wiser to completely ban selling such projects of rainbow capitalism, or do you think, you said earlier that it was maybe a source of comfort? So what are your opinions about all of that?
Yeah, I mean, a complete ban would be unwise because of how I said, young queer people take refuge in any form of support. Whether it's when they're closeted, they just like to see a little symbol that reminds them that, they're safe. And those who have just come out, who really want to fully express their pride with merchandise. And to me, it's a part of the process of coming out. It's sort of like hitting puberty for queer people. You want to just cover yourself in rainbows and be really, really proud and out and proud before you can really understand yourself and just have some more introspection.
Mhm.
But I think that, there should be a family held agreement or some sort of accountability, a system that ensures that the profit from the merchandise is going back towards the LGBT community. Because if you're going to use the community to make sales, you should really ensure that you're giving back to the community, because it's because of these big corporations that systemic discrimination happened in the first place, and that we need pride in the first place. So I think that it's really important to remember not to use the community for your own personal advantage.
Mhm. Yeah, I think what you said there at the very end was really important. The systemic discrimination part, and how a lot of corporations fuel discrimination, especially systemic discrimination, and all of these issues. At the end of the day, like a lot of from LGBTQ plus rights to a lot of racial issues. I think a lot of it is more so fueled by capitalism. There's just a personal issue. This is just a personal opinion, but I think what you said right there was really, really important. So thank you very, very much for contributing to our interview session. I think that will be the end of it. So yes, thank you very, very much for joining us today at 9 a.m.
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. And to all our viewers out there, our next interview will be conducted by Sarah Kimura, and she will be talking about youth activism in Kazakhstan. So thank you very much once again, Maëlla, for your opinions, and we will see you all next week. Bye.
Thank you.